Hello beautiful people, how you going? It's so nice of you to join me. Thank you very much for your time. Today we're going to be talking about some Nikon products and quite specifically the Z camera system, and we're going to be mentioning a bit about the new firmware upgrade. Now we've just recently got a firmware upgrade and we're always happy to get any sort of incremental increase. And today we've gone from 1.3 to version 1.4, and that's wonderful. It's always great and welcoming to have any upgrade and bug fixes. So what we're going to review today is some of these improvements and some other lenses and products that have been released very recently. Now, one thing I'd like to talk about is the fact that it's a version 1.4, and of course I've got to get that elephant in the room. I've got to address it. Where's our 2.0 upgrade? Because obviously incrementally this is appropriate. You start off with the default from the factory of a version 1.0 firmware, and then it rapidly goes to a 1.1, and then a couple of months later it's a 1.2, and then a 1.3 several months later, and now with a year, I suppose, after production, we're in the 1.4 zone. And the 1.4 is very welcome because there are some good bug fixes and little additions in there that are very helpful. Mind you, having said that, I have to address the elephant in the room, and that is that we're not up to 2.0 yet, and I think we're lagging quite behind. When you consider that the Z9, for example, it's just released and been out a few months only, and you're waiting like 3 to 6 months to even get a camera if you're lucky, that's already up to version 2.0. And it's got massive increases in its performance. So yes, they did promise these increases, and it was appropriate that they released it. What I feel is inappropriate is it's taken so long for the Z7II and Z6II to get a reasonable firmware upgrade. I mean, at 1.4, we're still talking about very minor incremental increases. So let's just address that. So you start off with a default, and the default when you purchase the camera is the factory set, and that would be a version 1.0. And then you get a 1.1 very quickly, and then after about another 2 or 3 months you get a 1.2, and then months later you get a 1.3, and then we're at where we are now is a 1.4. And that is in concession and appropriate proportions. However, we are talking about very little increases. They're very, very minor incremental increases, usually just predominantly bug fixes and maybe a few minor advancements, but it's usually a 10% increase in performance each time. And that's why they are called a 1.1. It's not called a 2 or a 3 or a 4. We're not massive leaps and bounds here. We are talking about minor details. So how it is that the Z9, in only a few months after release, is already on firmware 2.0 bewilders me. I think it's obvious that they promised increases very soon, and they said that they would install many, many new features, and that was great. I'm glad that the Z9 users have what they do, but a lot of us don't have a Z9 yet, and even if we had the money we couldn't get one. It's just taking so long from the factory to release them. So having the Z7II and Z6II sort of held back and slow increases in firmware upgrades, I find a little bit disappointing, I have to be frank with you. But in reviewing what they are giving us, well, we are getting some advantages, so we'll take what we can get, hey. So initially we've got the idea of having the 800mm lens that's recently been released added and incorporated into the system. So that's wonderful that we can use that lens should we purchase it. Now, do I like this lens? Well, actually, yes, I do. I think it's a great lens. I think in comparison to the 400 2.8 that was released recently with a teleconverter built in, that was an extremely expensive lens, and it's some, $22,000 Australian. That's an insane amount of money for a lens. Brilliant lens, yes, and very versatile, but let's face it, it's incredibly expensive and out of the range of many photographers. Having the 800mm, so you've got a long focal length and around the $10,000 Australian, makes it a lot more affordable. So probably if you can afford a Z9, you can probably certainly afford the 800mm f6.3. Now, addressing the 6.3 that it comes in, I don't find that actually an issue for that focal length. I mean, after all, the best you can ever do at 800mm is 5.6 anyway, and 6.3 is like a third of a stop worse, so it's really not that significant. In fact, a couple of hundred ISO extra and you'll make up the difference in brightness you wouldn't even notice. The depth of field, for example, at 800mm is insanely shallow, so you're not going to have to worry about not blurring out the background. It's going to do that just because of its focal length anyway. So I think it's a great lens and very affordable and a great purchase. However, for my personal uses, I would actually think I would like to still hold out a little while longer. I find the 400 at 2.8 not particularly usable for me at its designed focal length and aperture. How many times do I shoot 400mm at f2.8. I can assure you it's not very often, mainly because it's just too shallow and also very, very bright. And then I'm having to increase the shutter speed to compensate. And you can do that. You can put filters in, increase the shutter speed, but ultimately you're sort of defeating what the design is. I don't have a lot of applications for 400 at 2.8. That would be something I'd use maybe only 10% of the time. So to buy a lens that's structured for a specific purpose and find you only using that purpose 10% of the time, to me is a little bit odd. So when the teleconverter is activated and you've got the extra 1.4 reach, you end up with about a 560mm focal range at f4, and that's probably more practical. But then what I ask you is then why not buy that focal range? So this is what I'm encouraging people to do, what I would be doing myself if I have a choice, and I'm going to purchase a long focal length Z-mount lens. I'm going to be looking out for the 600mm, because I believe the 600mm, when it's released later this year, will be a 600mm f4. And to me, that's a very usable focal length and a very usable f-factor. Now, I had the 200 to 400 f4, and at 400 the f4 was beautifully bright and very shallow. In fact, almost too shallow many of the times. So I think a 600 f4 is actually the ideal focal length. And believe me, the difference between 600 and 800 mils isn't as much as you may think. It may sound a lot longer, the 800, but really it's just really a incremental little crop into the image. So if you've got a very bright and clean and sharp image at 600 mils, to crop in that 20% to get to 800, well, I tell you what, that's still going to look amazing. And of course the brightness is very important, and the shallow depth of field. So for me, a 600 f4 is what I'm holding out for, and I can't wait for them to release that. I imagine the price will be somewhere in the middle of the two, so it won't be as expensive as $22,000 for the 400. It won't be as cheap as the $10,000 for the 800. It's most likely going to be around $15,000 to $16,000, and I think that's going to be sort of a better buy, be honest with you. Just think about it. You've got a 600 f4 and you put a teleconverter on that, so it's a 1.4, you've got well over 800 mils, probably 850. You put a 2 times on that and you've got nearly 1200 mils. So, that's going to be very usable. So that's the lens I'm sort of shooting for, and I can't wait for that to be released. But the other lenses that come out, of course, are magnificent, and they have a particular use case scenario, and if that's yours, then good on you, and I hope you have a lot of fun with them. But for me, a 600 f4 is really what I'm holding out for. Having said that, let's get back onto the program and the various different things that they've released. So some of the other releasing features we've got in our firmware is that they allow you to use the focal rings and interchange them. So whereas, for example, on this, I'll just use this as an example, I have the 70 to 200 here, and this is actually the only lens that it's compatible with yet, but I'm sure the others will be increased later, is that you have a purpose-built little auxiliary ring here very close to the end of the lens, and that can be used for any function at all. Well, they've incorporated it now such that instead of having to use your focus here, which may be inconvenient when you're holding the lens and you may be rotating that might be a bit of a nuisance for you if you're using autofocus. So what they do is they allow you now to use this for focusing should you wish to keep it out of the way for the odd times that you do manually focus, and that's a pretty clever idea. So you just got more versatility with the different rings and the options that they provide, and I think that's fantastic. So the more little changes they make and options they give you, the more usable these lenses are, and all these little function buttons become. So there's a few function button improvements too, and having the different options of the different rings I think is great to interchange them to suit your hand use and your positioning of your hands. So that's fantastic. So good on them for doing that. The other, I suppose, most relevant thing is there's an autofocus increase as well, and they've improved autofocus, particularly in low light, they say. Now, how much of an improvement that's going to be? Well, they didn't rave about it, but I will say that it's probably a 10 to 15% increase, and I think that that's welcome, but it's not remarkable. So don't be thinking that now it's transformed and your autofocus is going to be as good as the Z9 and it's amazing. There will be an improvement, and that's always welcome. But we're still waiting on that 2.0 or 3.0 firmware upgrade to really smash it out of the ballpark. So let's just hold on for that one and hope it doesn't take too long. My guess would be 2.0 is probably 3 months away. So middle of the year we should have that, and then we should notice a substantial increase in autofocus ability. But having said that, any increase or improvement they give us, I'm happy to accept it and welcome it. So the autofocus generally in photography is terrific. I've got no issue with it at all. I do a lot of portrait photography particularly, and bird and wildlife photos, and I find that I tend to use the autofocus but with single point, and I will actually choose the focus point manually. So I'm sitting there with the camera and I'm actually choosing the focus point with the wheel, because that's the way I'm comfortable and familiar with. So if I'm taking humans, for example, or taking portraits of people, can you use the eye detect? Well, yeah, if conditions are really good, the lighting is perfect, and you're filling the frame of the subject, yes, you'll always get the eye in focus and the autofocus will do everything for you. But I got to be honest with you, I still like to choose my focus point. I just find it just as quick to put the point over the eye that I particularly want in focus, depending on where the head is tilted, rather than rely on the autofocus and pick the wrong eye, then have to switch it over to the other eye. Yeah, it's quick, but it's no quicker than just choosing the focus point you want anyway. So I just stick with that, and that's what I found very useful. So I'm not too worried about photography autofocus, but what I am very excited about is improvements in the video autofocus, and I'm looking forward to those improving and really sticking onto a subject under many different conditions. So that'll be more than welcome in the future. So I'm looking forward to that coming. So one other thing I would like to talk to you about today, and I won't waffle on too much about it, but I did have a gentleman I commented with regarding the L brackets on these cameras. Now, as you can see here, I use an L bracket on both of my Z7s. This happens to be the Z7I now. I'm filming with the Z7II, but I'll just illustrate my point with this. The gentleman had purchased for his Z9, I should say, a new L bracket. And the gentleman was, I won't mention his name because that's not fair or kind, but he was having issues with it. He was saying, oh, I can't get the flaps up and it's really annoying, and the mount here is in the way and it's a bit of a problem. And I just wanted to clear up for anybody who does happen to purchase an L bracket how these things are designed to work and why. So yes, you can actually access them by flicking them up with your finger and opening them up in the little cavity that they provide, as I'm showing you right now. So you can access them and you can use them. But I understand that on the Z9 particularly, it's a little bit more awkward because the flap lifter is actually on the side here, on the side of the rubber panel, and of course the bracket here does interfere with it. So what's the solution to that? Well, there's two solutions. So the first solution is you can open up, if I just release this, you can open up this and give yourself more room to access the rubber flaps and make that a bit easier for you when you're putting in your HDMI or your USB 3 and whatever you're using, or microphones and headphones. So that's fine for when you're doing video. You can actually open that up and use it. But I'll be honest with you, what I actually prefer to do is if I'm using video, I actually prefer to remove the L bracket altogether. So that is this arm part. So I remove that, and then you've got complete accessibility to all the little flaps and rubber gaskets you need to install your little components. And that's exactly what I've got on my Z7II now. I don't have an L bracket on it when I'm doing video. You can still use the L bracket for the sake of the Arco Swiss mount on the base. And let's face it, if I simulate it by putting it here on this little mount here, little ball head, and I'm shooting video on this, you must appreciate, of course, that when you're doing video, you've always got it horizontal. There is no situation that I've ever heard of where you're shooting video in the portrait position. That's just insane. So you're going to have it up and straight anyway. So seeing you're going to have it horizontal, there's no use for the bracket here that mounts for the horizontal purpose when you're doing video. So just take it off. And then, of course, you've got full access to all your rubber gaskets and you've got no issue. So I just thought I'd bring that out to people, that just remove this when you're doing video because it serves no real function whatsoever. Yes, you can use it for mounting accessories, which can be useful. I'm tending to mount whatever accessory I'm using on the hot shoe. And right now I have a bracket, and the bracket is like a little bendy shape here that I've got, and I've got two hot shoe mounts on it, and I can now mount with little ball heads anything I like on that. And I find mounting it up here is a lot more practical than mounting it on arms and then having that interfere with your gaskets and your accessories. So try to use accessories that enable you to mount onto the hot shoe. You can buy little brackets that come out and have hot shoe mounts, so you can put a microphone, or you can put a light or a whatever receiver you need to put on. So if you're going to put a monitor on, you can mount all those on, as I have in my camera right now that I'm shooting with. So that's just the thing I needed to point out, that when you buy these brackets, you can buy a full cage, for example. Now, small rig make a full cage for the Z system, whether it be the Z9 or Z7, and that does leave this area quite open and exposed. It has only a frame up the very front of the camera, and that doesn't then interfere with your gaining access to all those points. So I just wanted to point out to people that the idea of video with the Nikon system or the cages, small rig, whatever it may be, whichever company, is please just take anything off the side off, or buy a proper cage that exposes this rubber area so you can get to your little gaskets and you can open them up very freely and easy without any obstruction. So they do make specific video cages. So if you're doing a lot of video, and that's what you've got the Z9IV or Z7II, then just by all means, you can have a L bracket, but remove that little arm on the side. So I just thought I'd bring that out so people understand the functionality of these things. So if I'm taking photos, do I want this thing in? Absolutely I do. It's wonderful with photos, because that's the time when you've got the luxury then of mounting it in a position such as this, and then having your beautiful portrait style photography, whether you're doing landscapes or people, and you can use the L bracket for that if you want to use a tripod. But for video, no one shoots video in that position, so you just don't need it on at all. If you're going to do video, remove that and just have it placed on using the base, such as this. So I just thought I'd bring that out. To me, it was a little bit of a no-brainer and a bit obvious, but unless you're shown and you're actually someone who's used it frequently for such a purpose has explained it to you, you may not have got it. So that's pretty much most of what I want to talk about the firmware upgrade, but I will mention something. I've been taking a lot of photos very recently. I was using the Z7II with the battery grip, and I was using this beautiful 50mm 1.2 lens, which I just adore. I think it's a fantastic portrait lens. I am still looking forward to the 85 1.2 when it comes out, because I think that'll be very exciting. A bit more compressing of the image. I can get a bit further back, and that's actually very comfortable for the subjects. I do find with this one, I do tend to be getting in pretty close to the subject, and with COVID restrictions and that, you sort of want to have a little bit of distance. So the 85 will make that a bit more comfortable. But as far as performance goes, this is an excellent lens. So I love using it, and it's very comfortable. So what I've found is I've been shooting a lot at f1.2 when I do portraits. Now that can be some sort of an issue in that if you get the subject with their head slightly to the side and you're focusing on this eye, then by the shallowness of the depth of field of 1.2, the other eye's out of focus already. Okay, so sometimes that can be an artistic effect, and I quite like that for odd occasions, and that's great. But just because it's a 1.2 lens doesn't mean you always have to shoot at 1.2. You can shoot at 2.8 or f4 or f5.6 or whatever it takes to get the whole head in focus. And particularly if I'm doing subjects where there are 2 or 3 people in the image, I'm going to be shooting at 5.6, not f1.2, because obviously most of them are going to be out of focus then. I just get one person's eye in focus and the rest are a blur, and that's not very practical. But it's an excellent lens certainly for doing a single individual headshot or body shot, and you can do a full body shot on that and still blur out the background fantastic and get them tack sharp. So I'll show you some images that I took at a recent cosplay convention. I love doing the cosplay conventions because of the colors and the bright costumes and the glamour of it. So I'll show you some of those images that I was most proud of, and I think they turned out real well, and they're great samples of how good these Nikon lenses are and how fun they are to use. And I will say that I did have trouble on the Sunday. I was a Saturday shoot and a Sunday shoot. Saturday my front flash unit was working fine, which was diffused with a flash bender, and that was working great. I had some backlighting for speed lights with different colors for backlighting to give a bit of color and glow. The backlights were working terrific, and I could see them working, so that was great because they were in my vision. But what I forgot to check on the Sunday was the front lighting for the subject, and I didn't notice that I hadn't turned the speed light on, which was quite funny. So here I am with this speed lighter, all set up, ready to go, and had it turned off instead of turned on. So how ridiculous was that? But that was my mistake. It didn't actually destroy the images, and what I will say about the 1.2 aperture is it is so bright and it absorbs so much light that you don't actually even really need a forward light anyway. But when you've got it, just adds a little bit more pop and a nice little glimmer in the eye, and that's really nice and appealing, and it's good to be able to shape the light when you want it. But because the aperture is so bright, I was shooting at 1.2, and even though I was in the shade and I was outside, yes, I was outside, there was a lot of ambient light, but I had them always under a tree or under a bridge or some shady area, and I found I was shooting at 1.2 and at over a thousandth of a second. So the average was 1,000 to 1,500ths of a second, and I needed that shutter speed to reduce the light. So it just gives you an illustration of just how bright 1.2 is. It is very bright, even in shady conditions. So I encourage you to use these lenses. These lenses are magnificent. They do a great job. They save you having to cart a lot of lighting around, should you not wish to do so, and you get a beautiful blurry background as well. So thumbs up for those lenses, highly recommended. I'm so glad I purchased it. I've never regretted owning it yet. So yes, they are expensive, but they're worth every cent. So I just like to give you a 2 thumbs up on the f1.2 Nikon lenses. So that's all I'm going to talk about today. I won't waffle on too much, but I just wanted to address the firmware situation and say, well, we're still dragging our feet from Nikon and waiting for that 2.0 increase, but I'm sure when it comes we'll be blown away and it'll be very spectacular. Maybe it has something to do with the Z9's firmware. They're sort of milking parts from that and they're just testing it out and taking their time to get it right. Let's hope that's the situation. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to our next video. You have a great evening. Thank you very much.